today, I think, because the book I'm following, basically what I've been doing is following the stories in order and gleaning some things from this book, and the rest I have to do a lot of homework. And this is another area that just had me extremely frustrated because he just lays out all this stuff that's just matter of fact, this is the way it happened, and doesn't offer any other views. And I think that's I think that's a little bit damaging, because the thing with archaeology is, especially for these events that happened over 3,000 years ago, you can't say with 100% guarantee that these events happened where we think they happened. We can have some pretty good ideas, but there are always different dig sites and a whole lot of data that you have to weigh. And he doesn't do that. He just puts these statements out there, and he's like, okay, this is where they crossed, which I'm going to show you. Up here is the Mesopotamian Sea. You have the Nile Delta, that real fertile land up here that we showed you last week. So that's all in northern Egypt. And you have this little canal that comes down from the sea. And actually, this map it's not a good map. It is really hard to find a good map. Does anybody ever notice that? Like, people can't just put a good map online. It's really frustrating.
You've got maps in the basement.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm kind of, I should be old school, because those are good maps. I know what you're talking about. Those are those big, huge monster maps. And we used to have them hung all over the church building, and they're old. I mean, those are probably 40 years old or more. There's some pretty old maps, because I remember those when I was a kid. They're really good maps. I should just give up with the whole internet thing and go old school, because it's so frustrating.
Would it be easier to see them than when we're home watching it?
No, that's the thing. Yeah, online it wouldn't really be helpful to have those big maps hanging up here. But yeah, we should pull those out. But here's what the book that we've been following. It makes the argument that the Israelites crossed way up here on this little itty bitty canal, and then came down here, and they put Mount Sinai somewhere about here. This is the Sinai Peninsula. They put Mount Sinai right here. That's a minority view. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. All I can tell you is the more I study this, the more confused I get. It's really frustrating. There has been zero evidence of any occupying time that the Israelites spent in this region. We've uncovered literally nothing in the Sinai Peninsula. I think that's kind of important. Now, again, that doesn't mean that they didn't spend their 40 years wandering here. It just means that I'm a little suspect that we found nothing in this area. So he puts, there's a minority of people that put Mount Sinai right here. The majority of people put it somewhere over here. And this is Saudi Arabia. And a lot of people say that they crossed somewhere about here. And this is kind of interesting to me, and I'm going to give you both sides just so that we can kind of talk through that, because I'm undecided. I really don't know. Let's read the account in Exodus first, just to get a little bit of the story here. Exodus chapter 14. Exodus 14, starting in verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi Hahiroth, between Migdol." By the way, here's another frustrating thing about Migdol. In the book that both Charles and I are reading, and I think Kelly, you too, have a copy of it, he puts Migdol up somewhere north of the seas here. And so he says they crossed over and came down to Migdol. Other people put it over here. So depending on which crossing you have, Migdol's really close. And it's just incredibly frustrating because I wish they would just say, honestly, we don't have a clue where Migdol is. Like, that would be a more honest answer than to say, yep, it is right here. And these people are, yep, it's right here. So that's kind of, I just want you to be aware of that. So they encamp between these places in the sea in front of Baal Zephron. You shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second. I will say that, interestingly, the scriptures say, go over towards this place because it's going to trick Pharaoh, and he's going to say, well, they're hemmed in by the mountains. This northern route doesn't have mountains. This is in the flat plains of the delta. Over here, on this side of the sea, or on this side of the Gulf, there's one little path that goes between these massive mountain chains that comes out to the sea. I think that's worth noting. I think that's interesting because I would say probably the majority view is that the Israelites crossed here. And we'll talk about the problems with that as well. But just, we have to kind of piece this stuff together and try to figure it out. Verse 5, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people, and they said, what is this we've done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers all over them, over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them and camped at the sea by Pi Hahiroth in front of Baal Zephron. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. The Lord said to Moses, why do you cry out to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen. Then the angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was the cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. An interesting note about this. This phenomenon is actually a scientific, modern-day phenomenon. And in fact, and this is where it gets really bizarre. we have evidence at Lake Erie where waters were divided by a wind. It takes about a 60-mile-an-hour wind, which is harmless to people. It's strong, it'll blow you around, but it won't sweep you away. It takes a 60-mile-an-hour wind, and I forget what the scientific term is. It's like a downsweep, I think is what they call it. So the wind is sustained, and it comes down, and it hits the water, and it spreads the water apart, and after so many hours, it dries up the water, and dry land appears. And then as soon as the wind is gone, the water sweeps back like really rapidly. Lake Erie, this has happened several times. The last time that it happened, ironically, at the place where this book says that the Israelites crossed, it was recorded in like 1829 or something like that. Yes?
You had mentioned it, and I've seen it. They have chariots.
Yeah, yeah.
So where these massive hills and parts of chariots and things of this nature,
Yeah,
where are they at?
over here in the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, and we'll talk about, the strengths and weaknesses of that theory, but it is interesting because in this Gulf here, this Gulf that goes down into the Red Sea, and by the way, the Red Sea is a mistranslation. The proper translation is Sea of Reeds, and that's why some favor this upper region, because it's in the delta where things are really plush and things are growing like crazy. It's not in the desert, and reeds, these papyrus reeds grow like crazy up in this region. So, again, it's just this, if you were to split it 50-50 and say there's a good argument for the crossing up here and a good argument for crossing right here, both have equal, and in my opinion, both have an equal amount of strengths and weaknesses. So it's really frustrating.
Yeah, but it swings a lot more heavy.
When you find the chariots. Yeah. Yeah, and lots of them.
Well, and
Yeah.
also what you were talking about last week with the changes in the desert to the lush land.
Right. Yeah, because Charles, that's a good point. Because Charles was, I think you were the one saying, or maybe it was Victor, that there's evidence that back thousands of years ago, this was pretty fertile too. This was not all dry desert, and so even if that translation is right, we don't really know what the Sea of Reeds is. But it could have been a nickname for some of these seas. That would make sense. That's a good point. Yeah, if the climate was different then, which 3,000 years ago, who knows? A lot changes in 3,000 years. It's very likely that this was also plush land where there were reeds growing along the side of the sea here. So,
When you realize the Mount Seir Road is on that side.
right.
So why do you build a road if there's nobody traveling it?
Yeah, good point. Okay. Verse 26, chapter 14, then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. Now, here's where we're going to get into some of the fun stuff. So, Bob, you talked about the chariots. It's not the greatest picture, but okay, so right about here, roughly about here. And here you can see a little guide here. So that's 30 miles from here to here. So I didn't really gauge this, but I'd say that's probably, I mean, it's pretty long. That's probably about 10 miles across. Pretty significant crossing of the sea. That is a lot of water that would be moved by wind. And I think that's why up here this is appealing, because not only is the canal not that wide, but we've witnessed, it's recorded in recorded history, the waters separating where people can cross on dry land.
Yeah, but the only problem with them, and there's a lot of problems.
Yeah.
But one of the problems is it's a not very wide thing.
How does 600 chariots get buried on a little skinny?
We tend to get too much Hollywood going on here. He's got an army coming,
Yeah.
and we're only talking just the chariots.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't talk about the horsemen or the infantry.
Right.
So this is a massive amount. They're not all going to drown because they're not lining up in a long, thin line walking out into the,
Right.
so,
Well, and the other good point too that I think we can't overlook is that the Israelites, you're talking probably 1 million plus people. You're talking a massive amount of people that have to get across before all of these horsemen and chariots and soldiers. I mean, you're talking probably tens of thousands of army troops.
Plus their stock.
Right. Plus, yeah, the animals. You have, the children. Yeah, I mean, you're talking a massive amount of people on both sides, both the Egyptian and the Israelite side. So,
Where they cross, I guess would be nice. Well, when you look at the evidence, you pick one side or the other. None of us would argue that you had maybe 1 million plus Israelites crossing.
yeah,
10,000 troops, chariots, horses, whatever, probably, with a safe estimate, maybe more. But when I started teaching classes, I agree that we need to look at things and take the evidence and support it from how the world might look at it.
yeah,
But as we get into that, we cannot forget that it's the power of God that separated those waters, not just like a wind.
right,
It's the power of God that dried that land instantly.
yeah,
The power of God that held that water for how many hours for that many people to cross, whether it's a 10-mile crossing.
or a 10-foot crossing. Yeah.
And as they come through, what's he tell them? He told them before, you will not see these people again.
Yeah,
Where I think evidence is so important, because it does make it a lot more reliable.
yeah,
I feel comfortable in putting that trust in God, that he could separate those waters, even if it was a bigger body of the Red Sea down there,
yeah,
and hold that until the right time.
yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's a point well taken, and I think we mentioned last week about one of the problematic things on both sides, both on the side of science, secular science, and both on the side of Christians, is that when they become so religiously devout to whatever it is that their ideology, on both sides, they lose their ever-loving minds. And you get these Christians that are equally as crazy as the scientists who take a theory, they come up with a theory and they say, well, the Bible says it has to be so. So they already have the conclusion, and then they have to take their theory and they bend that around the facts. That's problematic, whether you take a secular view and you come up with a theory. There is no God of the universe. There is no such thing as miracles. So, yes, this could have happened, and we know that there's evidence with chariot wheels and all that stuff, but, science will say that it can only happen on this little thin strip, so, they don't have an explanation for the chariots that are not the thin strip. So, both sides, I think, are so dedicated to their ideology that that they don't weigh the facts. And both sides, I think, to find a really fair ground, you have to say there are certain things that we may not never know the answer, but very good point well taken is that as Christians, without losing our ever-loving minds, you cannot get away from the fact that the God of the cosmos is far more powerful than any being anywhere in any time in history. And even scientists, a growing number of scientists who are flat-out atheists say there is some form of intelligent design. We haven't found the mathematical equation for it yet to really figure that out, but there was some form of intelligent design. With that being said, you look around at some of the wonders of the world, and you can't help, whether you're a believer or not, you can't help but to take a step back and say, this was a massive force that can't be explained by science, at least not logically. So I think that's safe to say that it didn't have to be this little wind, 60-mile-an-hour wind, that pushed back this little, skinny body of water. The God of the cosmos, time again, did these major catastrophes. We looked at Sodom and Gomorrah. There is absolute evidence that it happened. We know it happened. Whether you're a believer or not, we know it happened. And that it destroyed for 500 years. There's no evidence of any vegetation in that region. We know it happened. There's evidence all over the world that shows that there was a catastrophic flood that was unprecedented on any recorded level in the history of mankind. And we have recorded major floods that wiped out entire civilizations. But there's evidence all over the world that shows roughly about the same time in history, there was this massive catastrophic flood that cannot be explained by anybody. It happened. We know it happened. So, yeah, point really well taken. So could God have parted the sea 10 miles wide by this wind? Well, sure, absolutely. Doesn't mean that we blindly say, well, this has to be the spot. This is it. But I think we need to consider all the different angles of this. Now, what's interesting about this Gulf of Aqaba is that the average depth goes deeper than 5,000 feet. That's a mile deep. This is a deep, deep gulf. Another interesting fact is that where we found the chariots, the floor comes up from the ocean by thousands of feet. And it's this little shallow platform that stretches exactly from side to side. There are no places in that platform where it drops down, 500-800 feet, 1,000 feet. There's no place. It's all uniformly. This platform is really shallow from side to side. That's interesting to me. That's noteworthy. That's something that cannot be disputed. Nobody can come back, atheist or Christian, and say, no, that's not true. We know it's true. We've taken soundings, and it's incredibly shallow. So what did we find on this little shelf that goes from side to side? This, I think, is one of the most interesting, because if anybody knows anything about wood under the ocean, wood doesn't survive thousands of years. It can't survive thousands of years, especially in corrosive salt water. What happens to wood is as it's deteriorating, coral attaches itself to the wood. And coral will take the shape, generally speaking, of whatever it attached itself to. that will last for thousands of years if it's undisturbed. If it's left undisturbed, coral will take the shape of whatever wooden object that it formed, whether it's a ship. We've found ships underground. We found all kinds of really cool objects that the coral takes the shape of that. This one's interesting because this is also on that shelf in the Gulf of Aqaba. This is a four-spoked wheel. Look at the shape that this is in. Here's one spoke, 2, 3, 4, with a hub here. Now, why does this still exist? Any ideas? Gold. It was covered in gold, so there is no wood left. This is a golden ring. They actually have left it here because it's so brittle that they don't want to disturb it, so they went down, they photographed it, took all kinds of pictures. What's interesting about the four-spoke chariot system is that guess what time period that dates to? The 19th dynasty. The same time period in Egypt, Israelites living there. The Israelites came out of Egypt under second. We have drawings that show the four-spoke wheel system on the chariots. That's pretty important. So what else did we find here? So you have this, and if you look, we have lots of these that look just like this on this shelf. So this is it's a bottom platform here. If you kind of see, man, allergies are really kicking my rear end today. We have this bottom coral here, and then we have this vertical shaft, and then we have an upper that's the same, it mimics the bottom. So what does that look like to you? Yeah, wheels connected by an axle. It looks like an atomic bomb. An atomic bomb, yeah, it kind of does. So this is the same width as what these chariot axles would have been. That's not insignificant. And if this were the only one, that would, maybe you could explain that away and say, well, coral reef just did this really cool thing. It's a stretch to say that this is a wheel and an axle from a chariot. But this, that we know is a wheel from a chariot from the 19th dynasty in Egypt. That's an Egyptian chariot wheel. We know that for sure. But then you have tons of these formations all on this shelf from side to side. That's significant because there were 600 chariots. So this is an article. We have a few minutes here. I'm going to show you this article that was published in the Washington Post back in 2012. I'm going to ring that first bell here. So I'm just going to read a couple excerpts from this. It says, no, really, there is a scientific explanation for the parting of the Red Sea in Exodus. So they show a 63-mile-an-hour wind from the east, and it parts this water. You can see how it pushes it back. It goes in the same direction as the canal, and it ends up splitting it. Then you have this little peninsula in the middle, so it shoves it aside. This happens. I mean, it not real often, but it happens. My mic keeps cutting out. I wonder if I should switch mics. I don't know if it's a battery issue. We have new mics that we're still trying to figure out. Do what? Oh, okay. I'll just talk like this. Would that be creepy? A little. Yeah, I'll see if we can get one of the head things, because I move my head a lot. Okay, on Friday, the blockbuster film opens directed by Ridley Scott and starring Christian Bale as Moses. Blah, 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 blah. This, of course, thought by believers to have been a miracle, an act of divine providence to save a chosen people. However, for software engineer Carl Drews, that might have been something else. According to Drews, who described himself as one of many Christians who accept the scientific theory of evolution, the story of the parting of the Red Sea, as described in the book of Exodus, might have originated in real life as a weather event. See what I mean about, like, here's somebody who, he buys into the evolutionary theory unapologetically, claims to be a Christian, and so he says there has to be a scientific phenomenon for this event to take place. There can't be a miraculous explanation. So he's really reaching, and lo and behold, there is a scientific explanation for how water parts. So he just latches onto that. So that's how it must have happened, right? You see how that works? That's called confirmation bias. You already have formulated in your mind what your bias is, and then you look for things to confirm it. That's confirmation bias. So he says, I'm arguing that the historical event happened in 1250 BC and that the memories of it have been recorded in Exodus, says Drews. The people of the time gloried in God and gave God credit. So you hear what he's saying. The people of that time gave God credit for this. You know, this was just a weather phenomenon, and, these dumb idiots, give God credit. Yeah, an incredible coincidence. So what's interesting about this is, what's the guy's degree? You remember? Yeah, he's a software engineer. He's a computer nerd. And I'm like, okay, so the Washington Post is writing this as if it's gospel fact, really. I mean, this doesn't appear to me to be an opinion piece. It appears like they're saying, hey, look, we have this figured out. So all you Christians, settle down. We have this software engineer who has this all figured out. That's interesting to me. The idea may sound hard to believe, and it certainly has as many detractors, but Drew's research was conducted for his atmospheric and ocean sciences master's thesis at University of Colorado Boulder, published in a peer-reviewed journal, and then promoted by his employer, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, a top research center. So he does have experience. I can't completely make fun of the guy, but he does have experience and even a degree in this field. Doesn't have a theological degree, no. And yeah, and you just see confirmation bias through this, I mean, big time. So then he gets into where was the Sea of Reeds. This may be where the guy who wrote the book that we're reading came up with his fact that, this is where they crossed, up in this canal, north of this Suez Canal. There's another canal.
I wonder if we found chariots up north.
No chariots up north that I'm aware of. And it's interesting, too, in the book, he doesn't mention the chariots that they found down in the Gulf of Aqaba. Not a mention of it in the book. Because this was the one thing in this book that when I bought this book, I was like, man, I would love to dig into this whole Exodus event. Because I knew that back several years ago we found, I think it was in the, I want to say late 90s or like mid 2000s. It wasn't that long ago that we found all these chariots, all these pieces. It wasn't that long ago. And we're still learning a lot about it. So it's not like we found it and, everything was discovered. I mean, we're taking soundings now. We're looking beneath the crust on the ocean floor. We're really, really searching because this was a really significant find. So anyway, we are up on the clock, but I am strongly just in case anybody cares, I'm strongly leaning toward the crossing being over here, and Mount Sinai, of course, would be over here, which makes total sense because we have found inscriptions in rocks out in the middle of the desert on these really high peaks that show that there was a significant population living here. Interesting, because even if the climate did change over time, it still was a really brutal area. This wilderness is still not really occupied by people. This is a harsh, mountainous, wild climate with, doesn't have like roads going everywhere. I mean, there are mountains everywhere. And they're big mountains. They're huge mountains. It is a brutal desert. Yes?
And just keep in mind, when you talk about the Exodus coming out of Egypt, that's not modern day Egypt. That
Yeah.
peninsula was part of Egypt.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Good point. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Okay, yes.
One last thing, to credit the power of God, you're not going to march 1 million people in 60-mile-an-hour winds across the bottom of a sea. They're not, you understand, in a 40-mile-an-hour wind?
Yeah, you can't do it.
You're not going to march 1 million people in
Yeah.
60-mile-an-hour winds.
Yeah.
The water standing on both sides.
Yeah.
There's only one thing you can do that.
Yeah.
Maybe a good look at that is like Jim Pentori,
Yeah.
Weather Channel.
Yeah.
He's going,
Yeah.
because of the high winds.
Yeah. Yeah. That actually was. He got busted on that one. That may not be the best example, because even his buddies were making fun of him on that one. But all of us have been in strong winds, and Dave's right. I mean, a 60-mile-an-hour wind, especially if you're a little kid, you can't walk in that. It's hard for an adult to walk in a 40-mile-an-hour wind. I've gone out on our deck when we had sustained 40-mile-an-hour winds. It is tough. It is really tough to walk in 40-mile-an-hour winds. 60-mile-an-hour winds, which is what it takes. That's a threshold for this phenomenon to happen. Yeah, good point.
It was all naturally wind crossed. I mean, everybody seems to think that all the Israelites crossed, and then that phenomenon just stopped while the Egyptians were there.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty strong coincidence, isn't it?
Yeah. And especially with the evidence, like we know, and even with the bodies, I didn't get into that, but, it said that they found these bodies on the shore on that side. Well, archaeologists have gone back and, well, guess what's underneath the service? We have tons of, basically a mass graveyard that's underneath the ground. So we know that there were mass casualties on that side of the shore. There's just a lot of evidence. Again, it has its weaknesses, but if I were to take a pick, I would say certainly the most and best evidence is on the Gulf of Aqaba.
That a lot of those type of things have is that it can't be done naturally.
Yeah.
So you're
Yeah.
talking about, well, do you believe in God or not?
Yeah.
At that point, because
Yeah.
could God have used a natural event to have this happen? To some degree, yes, but there's
Yeah.
no way, as everybody's saying, there's no way that it all happened.
Yeah.
Like that you happen to get over 1 million people across this place, an army goes behind it, and then it comes it's either God or it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I know. Must be God. Okay. We're going to stop there, and we'll pick up in a little bit.